The wind howled like a wounded animal that night, rolling down from the snow-choked mountains and tearing across the frozen plains with a cruel kind of music. The world outside seemed to have turned to ice, hard, white, and unwelcoming. In the small cabin that stood at the edge of the valley, a young girl named Mary sat beside the hearth, her knees drawn close to her chest, her hands cupped around a tin mug of weak tea that had long gone cold. The fire flickered low, its orange light painting trembling shadows on the rough wooden walls. Her father had gone to mend the barn doors before the storm worsened, and her mother had been gone for nearly 2 winters now, taken by the fever that no medicine or prayer could touch. The house was too quiet, except for the wind and the occasional groan of the timbers. Mary pulled her blanket tighter around her small shoulders. It wasn't much, a rough wool thing patched and restitched too many times to count. But it carried her mother's scent still, faint and warm, like dried lavender. She buried her face in it whenever the cold crept too close or the nights felt too long. That blanket was more than warmth. It was comfort. It was memory. It was love stitched into cloth. She stared into the flames, watching them dance and sway, lost in her thoughts. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the world in white silence. She could hear the faint creak of the barn door swinging in the wind, and the muffled sound of her father's boots crunching through the frost as he worked. The clock on the shelf ticked with a rhythm that felt too loud for such a quiet night. Then all at once something different broke the stillness, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the creaking wood. It was faint but sharp, a cry, or maybe a groan. Mary's head jerked toward the window. She waited, listening. The fire popped. Then came another sound, closer this time, dearer, like someone stumbling, gasping, dragging themselves across the frozen ground. Her heart thudded. For a moment she thought it might be her father, hurt somehow, but then she saw his lantern light still bobbing near the barn. Whoever was out there was not supposed to be. She set her cup down, moved to the window, and wiped the frost with the sleeve of her dress. Through the swirling snow she saw a shadow, a man's shape staggering, leaving a trail behind him that looked too dark to be only melted snow. He took 2 more steps and then fell hard onto his knees. For a second he tried to get up again, but his body gave out, and he collapsed face first into the drift. Without thinking, Mary grabbed her blanket and ran for the door. The cold hit her like a slap as soon as she stepped outside. The air stung her throat and the snow blinded her, but she could still see the dark shape lying motionless near the field's edge. Her boots sank deep into the drifts as she fought her way toward him. Her small hands trembled as she reached him, brushing the snow from his face and froze. He was not one of her people. His skin was darker, his hair long and black, matted with ice and blood. His clothes were torn buckskin, and an arrow shaft stuck out from his side, broken halfway. Blood had soaked into the snow beneath him, turning it into a crimson shadow. She had seen faces like his only from a distance, or in the frightened whispers of travelers who spoke of savages and raids. But here now he did not look savage. He looked human. He looked dying. Mary hesitated. Her father's warnings echoed in her head. If you ever see one, you run. Don't you ever go near. But the man's lips were blue, his breathing shallow, his hand twitching weakly as though he were still fighting for something unseen. She knelt beside him, the cold biting through her dress, and pressed her fingers to his neck. His pulse fluttered beneath her touch, faint but alive. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and pity. The man's eyes flickered open, dark and glassy. He didn't speak, just looked at her, confused, maybe afraid. He tried to move, but pain twisted his face. Mary glanced back toward the cabin. Her father's lantern light was gone now, swallowed by the storm. If she ran to get him, the man might freeze before she returned. She looked down at the blanket in her hands, the only one she had, the one her mother had made. She hesitated for a heartbeat that felt like forever, then gently spread it over him, tucking it around his shoulders and chest. "It's warm," she murmured, as if her words could keep the life in him. "You'll be okay, I promise." She didn't know why she said it, maybe because no one else was there to say anything at all. The man's breathing slowed, his body relaxing slightly beneath the blanket's weight. Snow gathered on his hair, on the fabric on her sleeves. She brushed it away and tried to lift his head, but he was too heavy. Then she heard her father shouting in the distance, "Mary, Mary, where are you?" Her heart jumped. She turned and saw him emerging from the storm, his coat dusted white, his lantern swinging. He stopped when he saw her kneeling in the snow beside the wounded man. His expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to anger. "Mary, get away from him," he shouted, running forward. She shook her head. "He's hurt, Pa. He's freezing." Her father's boots crunched to a stop beside her. He stared down at the man, at the arrow, at the blood soaking into the snow. His jaw tightened and his hand went for the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Pa, no," Mary cried, standing between them. "Do you know what he is?" Her father barked. "He's one of them. The ones that burned the McCarthy farm last winter. You get inside now." "He's dying," Mary said, her voice breaking. "Please, Pa, please don't." The man on the ground stirred weakly, his lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her father hesitated, torn between anger and something else, something he didn't want to name. He looked at his daughter, her small frame shivering in the snow, her eyes wet but fierce. Then he looked at the dying man again. With a curse under his breath, he lowered the rifle. "Help me get him to the barn," he muttered. Mary exhaled in relief. Together they lifted the man, his weight awkward and limp. Her father carried most of it, grunting under the strain. They stumbled through the snow toward the barn, the lantern swinging shadows across the drifts. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the scent of hay and horses. Her father laid the man down in an empty stall while Mary ran to fetch water and an old sheet. Her hands shook as she cleaned the blood from his side. Her father snapped the arrow shaft, pulling it free with a wince. The man flinched but didn't cry out. His skin burned with fever. They wrapped his wound as best they could, and when Mary tried to tuck the blanket around him again, her father frowned. "You're using your mother's blanket on him?" She nodded, too tired to argue. He needed it. He didn't say anything more. He just sighed and rubbed his face, looking down at the stranger who had somehow found his way to their doorstep on a night no man should have been walking. Mary sat beside the man for hours, her small hands occasionally touching his wrist to check if he still breathed. Sometimes his lips moved, whispering words she couldn't understand. Sometimes he was still as stone. She watched his face, the lines of it softened by exhaustion, and wondered what his story was. Was someone waiting for him? Did he have a little girl too, somewhere out in the snow, praying for him to come home? Outside, the wind began to calm and the storm faded into silence. Inside the barn, only the crackle of the lantern and the faint sound of the man's breathing filled the air. Mary rested her head against the wall, her eyes heavy. Her blanket no longer hers, but his now, wrapped around a life she didn't even know, and yet somehow couldn't let go of. In that frozen night, surrounded by cold and loss, a small spark of warmth flickered, the kind of warmth that didn't come from a fire, but from the quiet, stubborn mercy of a child who refused to see an enemy where she saw only a man. And though she didn't yet know it, that one act, that single moment when she gave away the only comfort she had, would echo far beyond that winter night, carried on the wind across the plains, waiting for the day when kindness would return to her door. Riding not as a stranger but as honor itself, Mary barely slept that night. Every sound, the wind's faint whistle through the cracks, the horses shifting in their stalls, the slow, uneven breathing of the wounded man, kept her awake. She sat on the barn floor beside him, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the flicker of the lantern light dance across his face. He looked peaceful now, but his skin was pale under the firelight, and each breath seemed to drag through him like it cost him a lifetime. Her blanket was wrapped tightly around him, darkened by blood that had seeped through the layers of fabric. Her father had gone back to the house after making sure the man wouldn't die right away. He had grumbled something about foolish mercy and trouble finding us soon, but he hadn't taken the blanket away. That at least was something. Mary listened for his footsteps, half expecting him to come back and order her inside. But the minutes stretched into hours and he didn't return. The air in the barn was thick with hay dust and the faint, sweet smell of horses. Mary felt her eyelids growing heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. The man stirred occasionally, muttering in a tongue she didn't know. Once he flinched and reached for something invisible, as if fighting ghosts in his dreams. She reached out and touched his hand, small and trembling against his rough, calloused palm. "It's all right," she whispered, not knowing if he could hear her. "You're safe now." Outside, the wind had died completely. Snowflakes drifted down from a sky so still it seemed the world was holding its breath. The soft light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, tinting the world in shades of blue and silver. Mary stood and rubbed her stiff legs, then went to the water trough. The surface had frozen solid overnight, so she broke it with the back of a shovel and filled a tin cup. She carried it back carefully, crouched beside the man, and touched the cup to his lips. He flinched, but when the water touched his mouth, he drank. Weakly, but enough. Mary smiled faintly. His eyes opened just a little, and for the first time she saw them clearly, dark and deep like river stones. There was confusion in them, but something else too, gratitude. He tried to say something, but the words were soft and slurred. She leaned closer, catching only the faintest whisper. Why? Help me? The question lingered in the cold air. Mary blinked, unsure how to answer. Because you needed it, she said finally. It seemed simple to her, too simple maybe. But he closed his eyes again as if her answer was enough. Moments later, the barn door creaked open. Her father stepped in, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He looked worn, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He carried a pot of hot water in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. Without a word, he set them down beside her and crouched near the man. Still alive? He asked gruffly. Mary nodded. He drank some water. Her father grunted. He took the cloth, dipped it in the hot water, and pressed it gently to the wound. The man winced but didn't move. Arrow didn't go too deep, he muttered. Could have been worse. Still, infection'll take him if we're not careful. Mary watched her father work, his hands rough but careful. He had treated sick animals and even a few wounded travelers before, but never one of them. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened every time he looked at the man's face, the way he swallowed hard before touching him. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and wiped his brow. You've done a dangerous thing, Mary, he said quietly. I didn't mean to, she replied. I just couldn't leave him there. Her father sighed and rubbed his beard. I know. You've got your mother's heart, that's for sure. His tone softened for a moment, but then he glanced toward the barn doors, as if expecting something terrible to come bursting through. But his people, they don't forget debts or deaths. If they find him here, we'll be the next ones buried in snow. Mary lowered her eyes. He doesn't seem dangerous. Not now, her father said. But that doesn't mean the rest aren't. You can't trust what you don't understand. She didn't argue, though her small fists clenched in her lap. Her father meant well, she knew that. But there was something in the way the wounded man had looked at her. Something human. Something frightened, that made it impossible for her to see him as just an enemy. As the morning light filled the barn, her father stood. I'll go see if we've got any more bandages in the house. You stay here and keep him warm. Mary nodded. When he left, she sat in silence again, listening to the man's breathing. His fever seemed to rise with the daylight, beads of sweat forming on his brow. She dipped the cloth in the cool water now and dabbed it against his forehead. He mumbled again, words she couldn't understand, maybe names, maybe prayers. She wished she could tell what he was saying. Wished she could comfort him the way her mother used to comfort her when she was scared. Hours passed slowly. The light shifted from gold to gray as clouds gathered outside. The snow had stopped falling, but the air held that heavy stillness that meant more was coming. The man stirred suddenly, his hand twitching, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment he didn't seem to see her. He looked around, confused, like a man waking up in another world. Then his gaze fixed on her. You give blanket, he said weakly. Mary nodded. Yes, you needed it more than me. He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. Good heart, he whispered, small, but strong. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled back. You should rest. You're safe here. He closed his eyes again, his breathing slow but steady. For a long time she just watched him, her mind drifting. She thought of what her father had said. About danger, about trust. She thought of the other families in town who had lost loved ones in the raids, who would have shot this man on sight. She thought of her mother who had once told her, kindness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who needs it. The barn door creaked open again, and her father returned, a small tin box in his hand. He handed it to Mary. Clean bandages. Found some herbs, too. Might help with the fever. They worked together quietly. Her father didn't say much, but his hands were steady. The man moaned once as they cleaned the wound, and Mary held his hand until it passed. When it was done, they covered him again with the blanket. Her father straightened up, his back cracking. If he makes it through the night, maybe he'll live, he said. Mary glanced up. And if he does? He frowned. Then we'll have to decide what to do with him. She didn't ask what he meant, but she saw the shadow in his eyes. That night the wind returned, soft at first, then stronger, rattling the barn walls. The lantern burned low, casting long, trembling shadows. Mary stayed beside the man again. Even though her father had told her to come in, she couldn't leave him alone. Sometime past midnight he woke again. His eyes were clearer now, but his face was pale, his breathing ragged. He turned his head toward her. "Child," he whispered. "I'm here," she said softly. He struggled to speak, his voice breaking between breaths. "Tell them." "I was not your enemy," Mary frowned, confused. "Who?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the rafters where the moonlight slipped through the cracks. "My people," he said finally. "They will come. But you showed mercy. They must know." Tears stung her eyes, though she didn't understand why. "You're going to get better," she insisted. "You can tell them yourself." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The color was leaving his face. His hand, still clasped in hers, was cold. His lips moved again, too soft for her to hear, then went still. The silence that followed was deep. The kind of silence that feels like the world itself has stopped breathing. Mary pressed her ear to his chest, praying to hear a heartbeat, but there was only stillness. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, sliding down her cheeks onto the old blanket that now belonged to the dead. She sat there for what felt like hours, her small hands folded over his. Her father found her there when he came in with the morning light. He didn't need to ask what had happened. One look was enough. He knelt beside her, his weathered face softening. "He's gone, isn't he?" Mary nodded, unable to speak. Her father sighed deeply. For a long moment they said nothing. Then he reached out and laid a hand on her shoulder. "You did right by him, Mary. Whatever he was, no man should die alone." He lifted the body gently and carried it to the far end of the barn, where the snow had blown in through a gap in the wall. Mary followed, clutching the blanket to her chest. They buried him just beyond the fence line, beneath a stand of bare cottonwoods. Her father marked the grave with a simple wooden cross. When he turned to leave, Mary hesitated. Then, with a trembling breath, she spread the blanket, the one her mother had made, the one she'd given to the stranger, over the fresh mound of earth. The wind caught its edges and made it flutter softly before settling down. Her father said nothing, only watched as she pressed her hands to the ground, whispering a prayer she didn't have words for. The sky was gray and the world seemed still again. But something inside Mary had changed, something quiet and deep. She didn't know what it meant yet, only that kindness had cost her something precious, and yet somehow she didn't regret it. As they walked back toward the house, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The blanket lay still over the grave, white snow already beginning to dust its edges. She didn't know that miles away, in the forest beyond the hills, 200 warriors were already riding through the snow, following the faint trail of one of their own, the man who had died wrapped in a little girl's mercy. The days after the burial passed slowly, heavy with silence and snow. The valley seemed to sleep beneath its white blanket, every sound muffled, every shadow still. The small grave behind the barn became part of that silence, a quiet reminder of something that had happened, something no one in town would ever understand if they knew. Mary visited it every morning, brushing the snow away from the blanket she had laid there. Her father didn't stop her. He only watched from the porch sometimes, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The man's death had changed something in their home. Her father was quieter now, more watchful. He went out often, checking the fences and scanning the tree line, as if expecting someone or something to appear. Mary didn't ask what he was looking for, but she could feel it too. The unease in the air, the way the horses shied at unseen shapes, the way the nights seemed longer. A week passed before the first sign came. It was early morning, the kind where frost clung to every surface like glass. Mary was gathering firewood when she noticed it, a single feather stuck in the snow near the edge of the field. It wasn't from any bird she knew. It was long, dark, and banded with white. She picked it up, her breath clouding in the cold, and felt a strange shiver run through her. When she showed it to her father, his face went pale. He turned the feather over in his hand and stared at it for a long time. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "By the fence," she said. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the horizon, where the snow-covered hills met the gray sky. "They're watching," he murmured. "Who?" He slipped the feather into his coat pocket. "No one you need to worry about," he said, though his voice was tight. "But we'll keep the doors locked from now on. You understand?" Mary nodded, though she could tell there was more he wasn't saying. That night she lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind moaned outside, and every creak of the house made her heart skip. She thought about the man, the way he'd looked at her before he died, the way he'd said, "Tell them I was not your enemy." The next few days brought more signs. Once, her father found tracks near the creek, not boot prints, but moccasin marks. Another time, their dog, Rusty, barked and growled into the darkness until her father dragged him inside. Each time, her father's worry grew heavier, though he tried to hide it behind his usual silence. Then, one evening, just as the sun began to sink behind the hills, painting the snow in fire and gold, the earth trembled. It was faint at first, just a vibration that Mary felt through her boots as she fetched water from the well. She frowned and looked around. The air was strangely still, the birds gone quiet. Then she heard it, a distant rolling thunder that grew louder with every heartbeat. Her father stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He froze, head tilted, listening. The sound deepened, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves, hundreds of them, pounding against the frozen ground. Mary's bucket slipped from her hand and crashed into the snow. "Pa," she whispered. "Get inside," he said sharply. "Is it now, Mary?" She ran, heart pounding as the noise swelled into a storm of sound. She reached the cabin just as her father came running from the barn, rifle in hand. He bolted the door behind them, then moved to the window. The setting sun glared off the glass, but even through it, Mary could see shapes moving on the horizon, dark figures on horseback, cresting the ridge like a living wave. Her throat went dry. "How many?" Her father didn't look away from the window. "Too many." The ground shook as the riders approached, their war ponies kicking up snow in plumes. They moved with a kind of grim grace, their bodies straight, their faces painted in red and black. Spears and rifles glinted in the dying light. Within minutes, they surrounded the farm, a full circle of 200 warriors, silent except for the snorts of their horses. Rusty barked and growled until her father dragged him away from the window. The air inside the cabin felt thick, almost hard to breathe. Mary pressed herself against the wall, trembling. "Pop, what are they going to do?" Her father didn't answer right away. He set the rifle on the table, his jaw tight. "They're here for their dead," he said quietly. Mary's breath caught. She thought of the grave behind the barn, of the blanket still lying there beneath the snow. "They'll think we hurt him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe," her father said. "Maybe not. Either way, we'll face them with truth." He opened the door slowly and stepped outside, hands raised to show he held no weapon. The cold hit him like a wall, but he didn't flinch. Mary followed a few steps behind, unable to stay inside alone. The sight before her stole her breath. The warriors stood in perfect silence, their horses still as statues. The one at the front dismounted, a tall man with a broad chest and a face lined by both age and strength. His eyes were sharp, dark as flint, and when they met hers, she felt something like fire and sorrow in them at once. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise beads. Her father spoke first, his voice steady. "We buried him proper," he said. "He came to our door wounded and near dead. We tried to save him." The chief said nothing at first. He looked at her father, then at Mary, then past them, toward the barn. After a long moment, he gestured to two of his men. They rode forward, dismounted, and walked to the back of the barn. The silence was unbearable. Mary clutched her father's sleeve. "What are they doing?" she whispered. "Let them see," he said quietly. The two warriors returned after a few minutes. One held something in his hand, the edge of her blanket still wrapped around the grave. He said something in his language to the chief, who nodded. Then the chief turned back to them. He walked closer, each step measured, the snow crunching says. "You gave peace to a dying man," he said. "That peace belongs to you now." Mary didn't fully understand, but the gentleness in his tone made her eyes sting. The chief took one more look at the barn, then at the small grave. He knelt briefly, pressing a hand to the earth. Then he stood and raised an arm to his warriors. One by one, every man there lowered his head in silence. 200 warriors standing still in the snow, paying respect not through words but through quiet honor. The moment stretched, powerful and heavy. Mary felt something deep inside her shift. a realization that compassion could reach places even fear could not. Then, as quickly as they had come, the warriors began to move. They mounted their horses, the sound of hooves soft against the snow. The chief lingered for a moment longer. From his hair he removed a single eagle feather and stepped forward. He held it out to Mary. "Keep this," he said. "It means you walk in the path of courage." Mary's small hand shook as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then turned and climbed onto his horse. At a signal, the entire line of riders began to move, circling the cabin one last time before heading back across the plains. The sun dipped lower, casting their long shadows over the snow until they disappeared beyond the ridge. When the last sound of hooves faded, the world seemed to exhale. Her father stood still for a long time, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. Then he looked down at her, at the feather in her hand, the tears on her cheeks. "Your mother would have been proud," he said quietly. Mary didn't answer. She just looked out at the horizon, where the warriors had vanished, and then back at the grave behind the barn. The blanket was gone now, but in its place the wind stirred softly, as if carrying the whisper of a promise kept. That night the valley was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence, not fear, not emptiness. It was peace. Mary hung the feather above the fireplace, where the light of the flames made it glow faintly gold, and every time she looked at it, she remembered that one moment in the snow, when 200 warriors had bowed not to power or fear, but to kindness born from the heart of a little girl who refused to see an enemy in a dying man.